He tried to get his young son to stop yelling so he could regain order and calm. He asked for some space, but the flight attendant did not accept it. She turned and walked away without saying anything. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like and share this video with your friends. But Jody knew it wasn't over when she noticed the plane was turning around. The stewardess returned with her entourage. She knew that she would regret what she had said at that moment. Jody Dailydose was excited to see her family after months of complete isolation. But at least the initial flight from Naples to Florida went smoothly, even with her mischievous 2-year-old son with her. The flight attendants seemed to understand his position well and turned a blind eye whenever his son started doing his nonsense. But it was the flight from Florida to Illinois that was much worse than she expected. The plane was full, and Jody was already an unhappy traveler at the best of times. She placed the young Hayes in a window seat and put her mask on her. She was preparing to experience one more flight. Almost immediately, Hayes began kicking the seat in front of her, and Jody felt many pairs of eyes on her. She began to look upset as her breathing became slower. She knew what was coming, and it couldn't have been at a worse time. A tantrum. It wasn't the first time Hayes had thrown a tantrum, but when the flight attendants came over to see what was going on, Jody just assumed they would tell her to shut up. Sometimes a flight attendant would try to help, but there were few of them. This flight attendant was unexpectedly pressuring her to ask questions. He felt better when the snacks began to be distributed on board. She had promised her little son peanuts, and for that reason alone she had been fine until that moment. She pulled down his mask and gave him the peanuts, hoping they would be enough to contain the crisis. But a flight attendant was watching over her shoulder. The plane finally moved and began to move. Jody told her son to put down the snacks to prepare for takeoff. But Jody didn't know that the flight wouldn't be so easy, and that it would end in humiliation, more than he had experienced before. And it would be because of a flight attendant. Another flight attendant approached her and asked her the same question she had been asked several times since they had boarded the plane. Overwhelmed with trying to manage it all, she looked up and said helpfully, "Yeah, he'll put his mask on before takeoff. He's just distracted by snacks." But a more surprising problem would soon appear. Getting a young child to put on a mask is much more difficult than you might think. She had practiced many times with his son to get it, but it wouldn't be that easy. The mask was even colored to attract young Hayes. She told him that she looked great, but a stewardess would see to it that all his practice and her attempts were in vain. Once again, a flight attendant approached her to ask the same question that she had answered many times. "Please, give us room," she begged. The stewardess's eyes widened as she looked from Hayes to Jody, and then she walked away quietly. Suddenly, the plane came to a screeching halt, right there on the runway. Jody craned her neck to look out the window. She felt the movement of the plane as she began to move again, and felt a moment of relief. But little did she know, the plane was not preparing to take off. Slowly, he rolled until the nose of the plane was pointing in the opposite direction. Realizing that the plane had made a complete U-turn toward the gate, Jody felt his heart begin to race. Looking around at the other passengers, he was met with a sea of faces just as confused as his own. Panic building, she wondered if something had gone wrong. Jody couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong on this flight. Planes are usually delayed due to bad weather conditions, but today the sky was clear. He tried to find the flight attendant to ask her about the delay, but she was nowhere to be found. Then, Jody saw the cabin crew. There was a hush of activity as everyone hurried to crowd into a corner of the plane. Then, she heard whispers, and everyone was talking about her. A few minutes later, the stewardess returned accompanied by the director, the supervisor, the flight attendants, and the pilot. They were ready for the confrontation, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The stewardess looked at her smugly and then at Hayes, who had lowered his mask again. Jody had the feeling that she now knew what this was all about. "We're just trying to get used to it," Jody stammered, looking at her son as he pulled her mask up and into the correct position for him. "But she's 2 years old," she pleaded. But they didn't care that the boy had a hard time keeping the mask on. They were here to enforce their rules, even though they had a double standard. With a glint of triumph in her eyes, the stewardess, backed by all the flight staff, coldly informed Jody that Hayes couldn't fly and he had to leave. Jody couldn't believe it. She felt her face flush deeply red as the other passengers shouted around her, upset that her flight had been delayed due to her son's behavior. She had never felt so surprised and humiliated in her entire life. Stopping the tears of frustration and shame with just the force of her will, she decided to fight. They weren't going to get away with it. Aware that all eyes were on her, she began to protest. But the airline staff did not accept it. They refused to listen. Jody and Hayes were ordered off the plane, leaving the outraged mother and her son stranded at the airport. They said Jody had been kicked off the flight because her son wasn't wearing his mask correctly, but Jody knew that wasn't the real reason. Luckily, the entire altercation had been recorded. Jody began to formulate a plan. Jody and Hayes were now well and truly stranded. Jody couldn't believe the injustice of it all as she sat there, simmering. Her son had just turned 2. Couldn't the stewardess have been a little more understanding? Well, she was going to do something that would make her, and the entire crew who was present on that flight, regret what they had done that day. It was time to do justice. It turns out that Jody had work experience as a brand director at Porter Novelli, a large public relations firm in New York, before becoming vice president. According to its profile, Porter Novelli is a company best known for its position in the areas of technology, health and wellness, food, and reputation management. So if anyone knew how devastating bad PR could be, it was Jody. And she was more than ready to design it. Jody put her plan into action. He was going to kill off Southwest Airlines. She called the media to interview her and told everyone how they had treated her and her baby. And the media ate it all up. He scheduled interview after interview, and soon the story took over. His revenge had all the ingredients of a public relations nightmare. Jody saw a dozen journalists. She spread the word about her and played her role to perfection. After all, she was just asking that the airline consider being more flexible with its rule that children over 2 years old wear a mask on the flight. What if other mothers had to go through the same thing as her? Of course, an apology and a refund would be nice. Meanwhile, another story was emerging that Jody never saw coming. Neither Jody nor the offended Southwest Airlines flight attendant and crew had any idea that a passenger, incredulous at what she was witnessing, pulled out her phone and began recording the treatment of Jody and her son. It wasn't long before the reactions began to come hard and fast from all directions of the planet. Will Southwest Airlines be able to stem the tide? I felt like I couldn't believe what had happened. I was left wondering how I was going to get home, Jody said. What if I didn't have the resources to buy another $600 bill? Jody told ABC News. Jody also told reporters that she believes asking the flight attendant for space is what sparked a personal vendetta against her. And how was her son supposed to eat with a mask on? I know there's a line to draw, but let's be a little compassionate about everyone's circumstances, Jody told the news press. She was aware of CDC guidelines that state that any child 2 years old or older should wear an appropriate mask if social distancing is difficult. But what I couldn't understand was why the rules weren't consistent across all flights. On the way back, I was surprised that the flight attendants were much stricter, she said. While Jody was conducting interviews, the video of her and her son being kicked off the flight began circulating on social media. And then internet users began to raise a storm, with arguments on both sides. With the story gaining as much attention as it had been, Southwest Airlines was forced to address the issue in question publicly. But how were they going to respond?